may have seen this earlier in the day. We opened our programming with it, but it's worth a second look. Jon McEnroe, who had been playing very well of late, in a fourth-round match at the Australian Open against Sweden's Michael Pernfors, became the first man ever disqualified from a Grand Slam event for bad behavior. Earlier in the match, he had been accused of intimidating a lineswoman. There had been several arguments. Racket abuse is what that's officially referred to as. And then...
Code violation, verbal abuse, default, Mr. McEnroe.
Melbourne, summer 1990. The temperature climbs past 40 degrees Celsius. The sun beats down on centre court like a hammer. 15,000 people shift in their seats, desperate for a breeze that won't come.
I know the heat didn't help. I'm pretty light-skinned, and I know this is hard for people to believe that know me, but there was some very poor officiating going on.
You're a disgrace, and everyone here is a disgrace.
The balls, they were horrific. They were so inconsistent. The ball wouldn't bounce.
It's absolutely unacceptable.
The dog wouldn't play with them, I don't think.
Bad balls, worse calls, and a man with a temper.
At the flick of a switch, it could change. And, that volatility drew people in.
Answer my question!
Everybody knew about McEnroe. Everybody knew he was this loudmouth brat.
The question, jerk!
For 13 years, Jon McEnroe had pushed every boundary in tennis. He knew exactly how far to go.
Jon's understanding of where the line is was always excellent. He always knew how to push it as far as he needed to get what he wanted.
Until the day he didn't.
It was the first time anybody had been defaulted in men's singles in the Grand Slam.
I just screamed, "He doesn't know the rules! He doesn't know the rules!"
This is the story of one match, one moment, one devastating decision nobody saw coming. How genius collided with ignorance. When tennis changed its rules overnight. How compassion became catastrophe when officials tried to protect the tournament's future. How a forgotten Grand Slam reinvented itself and used Jon McEnroe to do it. The greatest entertainer in tennis walked off that day, and everything changed. This is Snap, the Jon McEnroe default saga. Episode 1. The Superbrat arrives. To understand what happened in Melbourne in January 1990, you have to go back. Back to the early 1980s. Back to a time when the Australian Open wasn't the jewel in tennis's crown. It was a problem, the distant cousin, the forgotten Grand Slam, the tournament no one wanted to play. Imagine you're a professional tennis player in December 1982. You've just finished a grueling season. America, Europe, Asia. Your body is aching. Your ranking is solid. The holidays are approaching. And then someone asks, are you going to Australia? For most of the world's elite players, the answer was simple.
Being at the end of the year is just not ideal.
Pat Cash, the wild-haired serve and volley specialist from Melbourne who would capture Wimbledon in 1987.
I've never seen that before, but that's a marvellous moment for him.
Scaling the stands in celebration and creating one of tennis's most iconic images.
The Australian Open, we're trying to find the right position on the tour. That's the bottom line. The players are playing all year. They get to sort of November, December, and they finally put their feet up and they go, what? I've got to get on a plane and go to Australia now? Why would they bother coming to the Australian Open? Go all the way there and get used to the grass courts, all that sort of stuff.
But before he was that champion, before he wore the checkered headband that became his trademark, Cash was a kid, a local kid, growing up in the shadows of Kooyong.
Incredibly fortunate to have, a city that I was growing up with having a slam. I mean, how often does that happen? It's pretty rare. I was from a sporty background. My father played for the Hawthorn Football Club for many years, and I did every sport that I could possibly get my hands on.
Kooyong, the genteel suburban tennis club where the Australian Open was played, where grass courts and traditions ran deep, but where international star power was desperately, catastrophically thin.
There was not a lot of incentive for the players in those days to come and play. It was for me because I was from Melbourne, but I think Australia really struggled then.
The Australian Open, one of tennis's 4 Grand Slam events, supposedly equal in prestige to Roland Garros, Wimbledon and the US Open, was dying.
We had a few years where Brian Teacher, great player, Johan Creek, of course, won a couple of titles, but there was opportunity for some of the younger players and the Australians to grab an Australian Open title. Vitas Gerulaitis was a great player, top 5 player for a long time. But it weren't Connors, McEnroe, Borg. There weren't the really big names. And something had to give. And, the Australian Open had to change.
In the late 1970s and early 80s, tournament organisers watched helplessly as the world's best players chose exhibitions in America, vacation time in the Caribbean, anything but Melbourne in December. The prize money was paltry. The timing was terrible. The journey was punishing. And slowly, inexorably, the Australian Open was losing its place at tennis's most important table.
Yeah, we struggled to get the big names, and my recollection of it was if we didn't do something, we might actually lose that Grand Slam.
Di Larkin. In 1990, she would find herself in an impossible position, seated opposite the baseline on centre court, inches from one of the sport's most volatile figures. But in the early 80s, she was simply a young official, a sports fan, someone who loved tennis enough to volunteer, to sit in the sun for hours, to make calls that players would scream about. She was there witnessing firsthand the tournament's existential crisis.
I was at university in Melbourne and I joined a local club out at East Burwood, and there was a notice on the notice board there and it said, "How would you like a front row seat at the Australian Open?" And I thought, I wonder what that means. And it involved going to a rules night and then sitting a rules test. I thought, I'm up for that.
And then, in 1983, something shifted. The Australian Open, desperate for relevance and fighting for survival, made a move that would change everything. They offered Jon McEnroe, the newly crowned world number 1, the sport's biggest draw, its most controversial star, something players of his stature rarely received. A guarantee. Cold, hard cash just for showing up.
I give the Australian Open organisers a lot of credit that eventually they sort of recognized that something needed to change because the top players weren't playing, and they actually offered me a guarantee a couple of years when I hit number 1.
But McEnroe had a condition, one simple, non-negotiable demand.
I said, listen, my parents, only thing they ask is to be home for Christmas. Can you be home for Christmas? And that was during the Australian Open. So that was another reason for me that I didn't come. And then when I became number 1, people, they listened to me a little bit more. So I said to them, if you change the date, I'll consider coming. And they did that.
Just like that, the Australian Open moved. From December to January. From the end of one calendar year to the beginning of the next. From irrelevance to resurrection. And in January 1983, John Patrick McEnroe Jr., 23 years old, curly hair defying gravity, red headband, the most electrifying and infuriating player on the planet, stepped onto the grass courts of Kooyong for the first time.
John was the most famous sports person in the world. So we didn't know, Australians don't know who the quarterbacks were or baseball players, right? We don't know who they are, but we know who John McEnroe is. I would say that he maybe was the most famous person in the world at one stage, more so than the presidents or whatever. Everybody knew about McEnroe. Everybody knew he was this loudmouth brat. Was he really, or was he just sticking up for what he believed? And was he a rebel? Was he actually somebody who actually finally spoke his mind? Bottom line, he was the best grass court player in the world. He may be one of the greatest fast court players of all time, His serve was so accurate. I think he felt like he could come out here and notch up an Australian Open title pretty simply. It's not that easy. It's the beginning of the year or the end of the year. European players coming out from cold conditions come to Melbourne. The grass is very fast. It's a high bouncing grass court.
15,000 Australians crammed into centre court at Kooyong. They came to see the legend, the superstar, the bad boy everyone loved to hate, or hated to love. What they saw was both brilliant and bizarre, because while McEnroe was unquestionably one of the greatest players to hold a racket, he was also about to discover that grass courts in Melbourne, waterlogged, slippery, unpredictable, were nothing like the manicured perfection of Wimbledon.
The problem we had with John McEnroe that year was that we had bad rain on the first 4 days of the tournament, and I don't think we hardly hit a ball until the Friday. So the courts were all very waterlogged.
Peter Bellinger served as tournament referee of the Australian Open from 1983 to 2005.
The court surface was not good, and I have to agree to that. Not that I admitted that to John McEnroe. But he was not happy with the court surface, and he was slipping a little bit on it. And he called me onto court and wanted the match to be shifted to an outside court, which was quite a difficult thing to do when we had 15,000 people in the stadium.
But in '83, Bellinger was a rookie referee facing his first major crisis. Bellinger refused. The match continued. And then McEnroe, standing at the baseline, delivered a line that would follow Bellinger for the rest of his career.
And that's when he made the comment that Mike Williamson, the late Mike Williamson, used many, many times over. If this court's got grass on it, you've got hair on your head. So I lived with that for the rest of my 22 years at the Australian Open, I think.
Bellinger, for the record, was quite bald.
Obviously, the beginning of the tournament is a bit slippery and greasy, and, I think Mac was slipping and sliding. Didn't like the court. But that was grass courts in those days, Even Wimbledon had a lot of bad bounces on their courts, and that's why the players were so successful at serve and volley. You get in, you don't let the ball bounce. If you can not let the ball bounce, then you got a better chance. And it was really tough to hit passing shots and returns, and John is incredibly good with his reflexes, and I think he felt that, the ball bouncing all over the place for his returns was really tough. And yeah, he could serve and volley, but now he's slipping all over the place. He started getting pretty frustrated about the whole thing.
As a player, he was probably my favourite player that I liked to watch because I thought he was an amazing tennis player. He had great touch, and I did really enjoy watching him play. But his antics on court, I never really ever approved of.
But beneath the wit and the theatrics, beneath the complaints of weather and court conditions, something else was happening. McEnroe was testing boundaries, mapping the edges of what officials would tolerate. It was a pattern that would define his career. Because John McEnroe didn't play tennis like anyone else.
Here is a point nobody will ever forget. McEnroe.
What an angle off the top spin backhand.
Oh, look at that. Beautiful shot. Pinpoint accuracy, 59.
Look at those good hands right there. Looks like he's out of the point, and now he's right back in it.
John sees the court in a way that I don't think many have. The angles, the geometry that he brings to tennis is very unique. He's a field player, so he's not a power player. So the way that he slices and dices opponents is very different from most players who have attacked the game with power. For John, it's about caressing the ball, making it difficult for the opponent to attack. There's a counter offense to the way that John plays tennis. And there's a brilliance to it. There's a softness, a deftness of touch.
Jim Courier, 4-time Grand Slam champion, former world number 1. One of the generation of American players who grew up idolising McEnroe, studying his matches, trying to understand how someone so unorthodox could be so devastatingly effective.
His ability to be where the ball is going to be before the ball even leaves the racket of his opponent, that was always a marvel to me. His anticipation, incredible and necessary because he didn't have the power to overwhelm. He needed all the other senses, and he had them.
As a tennis player, he was a genius.
Tim Henman is one of Britain's most celebrated players, a former world number 4 who grew up watching McEnroe.
With his technique, no one played like him, but with his natural ability, he was a genius.
John's movement was certainly incredibly effortless, but it didn't take any energy away from him. He used to drop the head of the racket, That was never done. Never. It was always bend your knees, bend your knees. No, not John McEnroe. He just dropped the racket. He used to side on for his serve. Nobody turned with their back to the court to do this. He did a lot of unusual things, and he used to move incredibly well. So his balance on top of his body was incredible. If you're leaning forward and back and sideways, you can't move as quickly as you can if you're sort of upright and balanced. And if you notice, John, when he runs, it's a joke. You never saw the guy off balance. His legs would be going everywhere, and you think of Novak Djokovic doing that or Federer. And Mac was the first one to be like that. He was all over the place, but he'd be balanced. And you think, man, he's kind of podgy. He doesn't even look like an athlete. But get a ball over his head, get a ball passing shot past him, no chance. And power, loosest racket you've ever seen. I'd pick a John McEnroe racket up with his stringing. There's no way I could hit the ball on the court. My shots would go 10 feet out. Go whoosh, anybody. It was like grandma's racket that'd been sitting in the back there and the strings. His little hit like this, and the thing would fly off. You go, whoa. He did a lot of things very differently, and they were really awkward to deal with.
But there was another side to McEnroe's genius, a darker side, a cost. Because for all his brilliance, for all his artistry and touch and supernatural court sense, Jon McEnroe was also profoundly, almost pathologically, unable to accept imperfection. And that inability, that rage against imperfection, made him both magnetic and maddening. A genius and a time bomb. Someone you couldn't take your eyes off because you never knew which version you'd get.
For McEnroe, it was the genius. It was the genius with the way that he played the game, his natural ability, his feel, his touch, his tennis IQ, but it was also, dare I say, the instability mentally. And that's why you could never take your eyes off him, because you felt that, playing incredible tennis, everything looked under control, but at the flick of a switch, it could change. That volatility, I think, drew people in. And yes, there were the tennis fans because he was such a great player. But I think when you can then connect with a different audience and bring more people to the sport, I think that emphasizes the impact that he's had globally around tennis.
I wanted to play tennis because of watching Jon McEnroe, Bjorn Borg, Jimmy Connors, Martina Navratilova and Chris Evert.
Sam Smith, British commentator and former professional player.
They are, for me, some of the greatest players of all time, and tennis became the centre of my world because all I wanted to do was watch them play, and I was absolutely transfixed by what they brought to the sport.
Like millions of others in the 1980s, Sam was drawn to tennis not despite McEnroe's volatility, but because of it. Because McEnroe did something no other athlete of his generation did. He brought people into tennis who'd never cared about tennis. He made the sport compulsive viewing for audiences who couldn't tell a forehand from a backhand, but knew they had to watch when McEnroe was playing.
What you get from Jon McEnroe is you get the real person expressing himself, and someone that brought so many non-tennis fans into the game. Not just because he was explosive and controversial and sometimes crossed the line, because he was just a genius. You just love watching him play. It was never predictable. He gave everything of himself, so much passion and fire. Sometimes that spilled over into anger. You could never take your eyes off him.
Yeah. No, well, that was always Jon, huh?
Mark Petchey is a former ATP Tour player turned respected broadcaster.
I'm not a massive fan of Hawkeye or electronic line calling because it is like sport is drama and you need characters like that. I mean, he's become as big as the sport, and yet back then people, he was just filling stadiums, which I think it will be an interesting one for the sport to how to maintain that kind of level of interest.
Jon has always been someone from the very beginning of his professional career that could break through sports coverage to the general population. It was his artistry, his athleticism, and his attitude that were just different. And people like different. And Jon brought a real different vibe to tennis. It was rock and roll. It was bad boy. And there was this attitude of you may love him, you may hate him, but you can't keep your eyes off him. And that's Jon McEnroe.
Rock and roll, bad boy, the rebel with the headband. By 1983, when McEnroe arrived in Melbourne, he wasn't just a tennis player. He was a cultural phenomenon. someone everyone had an opinion about, even people who'd never watched a tennis match in their lives. But that fame came with a price, a burden, the weight of constant scrutiny, of never being able to just exist without someone judging, criticising, or demanding something from you.
You know, I've seen incidences with Jon where he's very wary. So if somebody thinks you the biggest brat and the biggest arsehole of all time, and they all think that, you're going to be on your guard the whole time. Because I've seen people go, "You're an arsehole, McEnroe," just walk away. And I go, "That wasn't very nice." Getting going in our airplane, I was jumping in a plane with him, putting stuff up there. And the guy goes, "Get out of the way, McEnroe." And he goes, he says, "What are you doing, mate?" You know, Jon says, "Oh, I'm just putting stuff up." He's just putting stuff up here, kind of ignoring this guy. He goes, "You're an asshole." You know, this guy, you're an asshole, because he was kind of, in his space a little bit, trying to put stuff above the seat on an airplane. And I'm thinking, my God, you know, that's tough. That's really tough to deal with. So, not surprised that he didn't trust anybody.
He's one of the easiest commentators to work with because you just let him do his thing.
Sam Smith is a highly respected tennis journalist and broadcaster who spent decades covering the sport at the highest level.
What I really enjoy, though, is you can be chatting away at something and Jon will just connect two very disparate things and put them together. And that's like the moment, for me, of genius. That he's thought of something not always totally connected with the forehands and backhands, and he sort of fused them together and just come out with a great line that communicates perfectly the moment and the feeling of the moment and gets straight through to that viewer who's sitting on the sofa.
The blessing and the curse of being Jon McEnroe. Genius and time bomb. A man impossible to take your eyes off and impossible to understand in isolation. Because McEnroe is forever intertwined with one other man, Bjorn Borg.
Borg now at match point. There it is. Great backhand by Borg for a perfect ending.
I think probably was maybe one of my best matches I ever played because it was the most important match for me in my life.
I mean, Jon McEnroe and Bjorn Borg, I loved them growing up because they were so different on the court. And I just tended to pick little things, from every player, which what inspired me, basically, what I loved about them. And I loved the calmness from Bjorn. I loved the way he was moving. And then I didn't mind the fiery side of Jon McEnroe as well, because there was something going on, but also his game style, that he was coming to the net. He was trying to be aggressive.
Don't believe it.
Fire and ice, chaos and control. The brash American and the stoic Swede. It was tennis's perfect rivalry.
And that's the competitor burning brightly in him.
And it reached its apex in the summer of 1980 at Wimbledon, in a final that would be remembered as one of the greatest matches ever played. The fourth set tiebreak alone lasted 22 minutes. 22 minutes of tennis so exquisite, so brutal, so impossibly tense that grown men wept watching it.
Well, can either man take any more punishment like this?
McEnroe saved 5 championship points. 5 times he stood at the very edge of defeat, and 5 times clawed his way back. He won that tiebreak 18-16. But he lost the match.
I've heard Jon talk about it, how hard that was, but they had this rivalry, but there was so much respect.
1 year later, they met again in the Wimbledon final, and this time McEnroe won. A year after that, the US Open final, McEnroe won again. Then, without warning, without explanation that anyone could fully understand, Bjorn Borg just walked away. At 26 years old, at the absolute peak of his powers, he retired. Gone. Just like that.
Sometimes you lose sight of how lucky you are that you're an athlete, as opposed to you're making this incredible living. You're caught up in just, your whole being is sort of based on how you're doing, which is, hard to get away from. You're great. You're the man if you're winning. If you're losing, you're not a good person.
With Borg out of the picture, McEnroe stood alone at the summit of tennis, world number one, the sport's biggest draw, the face of the game. But there was another rival, another player who would push McEnroe in ways Borg never did. Ivan Lendl, the Czech player who later turned American, who hit the ball harder than anyone tennis had ever seen. Lendl was everything McEnroe wasn't. Mechanical, predictable, and somehow, impossibly, he got under McEnroe's skin in ways even Borg had never managed to.
70-80% of the time on my serve, I can foresee the first 3 or 4 shots of the point, which really helps, because then you see, oh, God, was he anticipating well? No, I wasn't. I just tried to set up the play which works for me.
Ivan Lendl was one heck of an athlete and a heck of a player, and hit the ball harder than anybody we'd really seen until that time. He was the Ivan Drago, and Mac, I think, was Rocky type of thing. You know, there was this hard Russian, Eastern Bloc guy who came over and I will crush you, and I'm fitter and stronger, and I will crush you. And that was the sort of mentality. But Ivan was also really, really cocky and confident.
If I serve well, I can control the point from there. And that's really important. If I control the point, I make the opponent run much more than I'm running. And that may show up at the end of the match.
I didn't really have any problems with Ivan, but the more I spoke to Mac, the more I started hating Ivan. I was like, oh, okay, he's a bit like that. Oh, yeah, he's like that. No. Hey, bloody Lendl. But Lendl had the edge over McEnroe because he used to, a lot of the time, because he just overpowered him.
John's serve gave me a lot of trouble in the past, and I didn't like it because I never could return his serve, and I was working so hard on it that now I'm returning so much better, and I can take advantage of it.
Serve volleyer against the baseliner, and it's the best contrast we could possibly ever have in tennis. And in that era, we had those great contrasts.
Johnny Mac is an icon of tennis because you know what? Deep down, he loves the game and has never said, I don't love the game. And the other thing is he always is so complimentary of the other players. I mean, he's an icon of tennis.
There was certainly a generation change from the old established to the modern era where players had freedom, money, and were big celebrities. There was an element of, oh, no, you guys think you're too big for your boots. And I think a lot of the players felt that.
McEnroe was rock and roll. He was rebellion. He was the future, whether tennis liked it or not. By 1987, professional tennis was at war with itself. And tennis needed more than rules. It needed enforcers.
I was one of the first band of professional umpires which were hired by then the MIPTC in 1987. So we were charged with trying to bring the game back to a little bit of normality, if you like. And so all the tough matches were thrown in our direction. So we learned very quickly.
Gerry Armstrong, one of the first truly professional tennis umpires, hired specifically to handle the sport's most volatile players.
We all know who those characters were. So the authorities wanted to push professional officials. So that was our job, to be seen to be out there every week and to kind of become a familiar face with the players in the hope that they knew who they were dealing with each week and we knew the players, and we were the pioneers, if you like, of officiating in those days.
Gerry would go on to become one of the most respected officials in tennis history, eventually serving as the referee of Wimbledon itself. But in 1987, he was a pioneer, learning on the job, one explosive match at a time.
You know, for most of us, it was just a hobby. We barely got paid anything. We thought we were pretty cool if we got lunch or dinner.
Di Larkin.
We'd be on a sit and stay, and if we were allocated a match, we would be on that match from start to finish. And if that match went 5 sets, you were there for 5 sets. You could be there for 4 hours. When it transitioned to Melbourne Park, there was a clear move into more professional officiating, and we started to be on court on rotation times. So we'd be allocated centre court, and you'd be in a team of people like we were at Kooyong, and you might be on for an hour 20 and 40 minutes off. You might be on for an hour or an hour off, or you might rotate from court 19 for a session, and then you'd have a break, and then you'd come in to centre court.
The hope was elegant in its simplicity. Familiarity would breed respect. If the same umpires appeared week after week, tournament after tournament, players would learn their names, learn their styles, learn their limits. The tantrums would decrease. The abuse would diminish. The game would return to some semblance of order and dignity. It was a noble idea. But it didn't work.
There was certainly a transition between the old school and the new school, and they didn't like players speaking out. They didn't like McEnroe speaking out and arguing. They didn't like me speaking out and arguing. And, the calls weren't great. And the players, generally speaking, I would say 99% of the time know if the ball's in or out, or certainly close. And when there's it's clearly out. They say, you should say it was clearly out. It wasn't clearly out. It wasn't clearly out. So you're lying to start with. Okay, let's get that straight. And what they used to do is you would warn a player very early on in the match, and that would calm them down. Oh yeah, that really calmed me down. Sure it did.
Pat Cash articulates something crucial here. Something that explains why professional umpires, far from calming the situation, might have actually inflamed it. The players didn't see these professional officials as a solution. They saw them as adversaries, as representatives of an establishment that wanted to control them, to diminish them, to strip away their personality and turn them into automatons who hit balls and said thank you and never questioned anything. And McEnroe, more than anyone else, bristled at that control.
You can't be serious, man. You cannot be serious. That ball was on the line. Chalk flew up. It was clearly in. How can you possibly call that out? How many you can miss? That he's walking over. Everyone knows it's in this whole stadium, and you call it out?
The umpire in tennis is not all-powerful, as it is in other sports, and there isn't the deference, really, to the umpires. I always feel there should be a way you should address a tennis umpire, whether you call them umpire Kooyong, umpire Armstrong. There's no set format. I think that's really important. Think about Gerry Armstrong in that chair. He was only following the rules as they were set out, and he had to do that. That was his job. But you could maybe say at times the rules were too constricted. They were open to interpretation. Things have certainly moved on to there. And I would say they're very strict now. And that is something I know Jon McEnroe has said. There isn't any room for players to let off a little steam.
So there was nuance here, grey area. Because while the umpires were following the rules, doing their jobs, as Sam Smith says, maybe the rules themselves were the problem. Maybe they were too strict, too constricting. Maybe they didn't leave room for human emotion in a sport built on human drama. Or maybe that's just what McEnroe wanted everyone to believe.
I'd been umpiring Jon as a professional for 3 or 4 years, so we weren't strangers to each other, and it was never an easy job for me, and I'm sure people know what Jon was like, but I would umpire him on a fairly regular basis, and everybody has their ups and downs, but I think in general there wasn't too much bad feeling either way, if you like. So we got on pretty well, professional relationship, and you never looked forward to doing Jon's matches, but on the other hand, you knew it was going to be a challenging afternoon. But I think going back to that day, I could sense Jon was tense, and thinking back to it now, and he was quite grumpy that day from start to finish. Now, I think it was 4th round, wasn't it? And I think he had been coming back from a period where he hadn't played very much, so I don't think it was expected for him to reach that far in the tournament. And obviously, it was quite a big moment for him. Maybe he was nervous, maybe he was on edge. But that particular day, I'm going to say he was pretty grumpy.
But beneath all the professional relationships, beneath the familiarity and the routine and the grudging mutual respect, something else was happening. Something that would change the calculation. The rules were changing, and Jon McEnroe might not have known.
The rules were to be changed on the code of conduct from a 4-step code to a 3-step code.
They changed the rule, going into the new year, 1990.
Patrick McEnroe, Jon's younger brother.
he paid a serious price.
Someone who watched from New York as his brother's career reached its most infamous moment. The change seemed technical, bureaucratic, the kind of rule adjustment that gets announced in a memo and is forgotten by the next tournament. Warning, point penalty, game penalty, default became warning, point penalty, default. 4 steps down to 3. For Jon McEnroe, a man who had spent his entire career understanding exactly how far he could push, precisely how many outbursts he could get away with, this rule change was catastrophic. 1 less step meant 1 less buffer between fury and disaster.
My understanding is that the rule change was not brought in for Jon McEnroe. A lot of the players, I believe, thought that the 4th stage, with the 3rd step being a game, that if they lost the game, that they may as well be defaulted. And I think there was a lot of discussion within the players group and the ATP at the time, and that brought about the change of the rule. That's my understanding of it. And any rule changes that were brought into effect took effect from the 1st of January of the following year.
December 31, 1989, Perth, Western Australia. The Hopman Cup, a mixed teams event. A New Year's Eve gala, a charity auction. Stevie Wonder has donated his gold tracksuit. The bidding is competitive. And then it becomes something else entirely.
They began rolling up at the Burswood Ballroom at about 7 for the ball to end all balls, a chance to rub shoulders with the tennis who's who. And at $150 a ticket, it sure was going to give the old bank card a nudge.
Every time Jon made a bid, Michael Pernfors would up the bid. And Jon was not happy, because he's obviously wealthy, but you don't want to bid again and bid again and bid again.
But money was no problem at the Hopman Cup ball. And when the auction came around, the big bidders pulled out their wallets. Biggest of them all is Jon McEnroe, who went hammer and tong with Mikhail Pernfors bidding for Stevie Wonder's tracksuit.
And now it's a match, it's a competition between Jon McEnroe and Michael Pernfors bidding for an auction item, which was Stevie Wonder's gold jacket that he wore on stage.
Eventually, it was McEnroe who took the match. His winning bid, $9,000.
And of course, Jon, being so competitive, just didn't want to lose. And Pernfors knew that, so he just kept bidding it.
Paul McNamee, Australian tennis legend, former doubles world number 1. In 1989, tournament director of the Hopman Cup.
And it's later that night, I get a phone call from security, and they said, look, there's an altercation in Jon McEnroe's hotel room at Burswood, I said, what do you want me to do about it? They said, he's just screaming. He's just screaming. I don't even like Stevie Wonder. I don't know. Why didn't you stop me from buying that jacket?
Classic McEnroe. Competitive to an absolute fault. Unable to back down. Even when it makes no sense. Even when he doesn't actually want what he's fighting for. But the Stevie Wonder jacket? That's just the sideshow.
I was really excited because the event had been around not that long.
Pam Shriver, 21-time Grand Slam doubles champion, Olympic gold medalist, McEnroe's playing partner at the Hopman Cup.
I had played the Olympic Games in '88. I was still a couple years from playing Pan American Games, so anytime I could represent the U.S., I liked to. And then when I found out who my partner was, it was going to be Jon McEnroe. We grew up in the juniors together, so I was like, let's go.
But she was about to witness something that would haunt her. And McNamee, Peter Bellinger, and eventually everyone. Because days before the Stevie Wonder auction, before the New Year's Eve gala, there had been another match, another moment, another confrontation. McEnroe had played against Italy's Paolo Cannet, and during that match, his temper had flared. He'd received a warning, then another, then a third. Under the new rules, the 3-step code that was supposed to be in effect from January 1, 1990, McEnroe should have been defaulted right there and then. But he wasn't.
So Peter Bellinger was a referee for both Hopman Cup and the Australian Open, came to me and said, look, if Jon does one more thing, I really should default him. And I said, oh, no way.
Peter Bellinger, the same referee who dealt with McEnroe at Kooyong in 1983, who'd had McEnroe tell him he had no hair, who'd watched McEnroe test boundaries for 7 years. Bellinger made a choice, a compassionate choice, a choice designed to keep the match alive, to avoid the nightmare scenario of defaulting Jon McEnroe from an exhibition event on New Year's Eve.
He said, however, because this tournament started on December 31, I can technically say we're losing last year's rules. So he's got an extra chance. He's got an extra violation. I said, absolutely last year's rules, absolutely. So, it's not 3 strikes and you're out, he's got another one. And of course, Jon does another one, but doesn't get defaulted. So that's all good.
He used the old rules, 4 steps instead of 3. Warning, point, game, default. McEnroe got his extra chance. 3 weeks later, he would believe incorrectly that he still had that safety net.
So fast forward to the Australian Open, and I'm down the peninsula driving back to Melbourne, and I hear on the radio that Jon McEnroe looks like he's being defaulted at the Australian Open, and I just screamed, he doesn't know the rules! He doesn't know the rules! I stopped the car immediately outside the Frankston Hotel on the Nepean Highway, raced into the bar and had a look what was going on. Jon's just standing there like this, like, he doesn't know the rules, he doesn't know the rules. He got defaulted. He didn't know the rule. I knew he wouldn't know the rule because at Hopman Cup he played, which was just before the Australian Open, he played under the old rules. I'm still guilty about that to this day. So I do feel it was my fault, not Jon's.
3 weeks later, Melbourne, 1990.
It didn't quite work out as planned. Let's just say that, because I was actually playing quite well and had a really good-looking draw and like a good chance. So talk about sabotaging yourself. It was unfortunate that things were looking pretty promising, and the next thing I know, I'm going to plane out of here.
Pernfors was a tough guy. I mean, as far as a competitor goes, and he had Jon flustered and frustrated. I know that Jon had moments, in the heat, and we McEnroes with our fair skin didn't always love playing in the extreme heat. So it was a multitude of factors, not to mention the fact that, we hadn't played that many years in Australia. He used to not go to the Australian Open. It used to not be as big of a deal as it has since become and started to become when they moved it from Kooyong. So I think it was a compilation of many factors, most being Jon's temper. And then number 2, for one of the few times in his career, not understanding the rules.
You don't want a default to take the headlines, and that's what happened.
The stage is set. The pieces are in place. And the temperature is climbing. Jon McEnroe versus Mikhail Pernfors. The same man he'd outbid for the Stevie Wonder jacket just 3 weeks earlier. Now on the other side of the net in the 4th round of the Australian Open. Gerry Armstrong in the chair, Peter Bellinger standing by, Larkin on the baseline. All of them knowing the new rules and all ready to enforce them. All except one person. What happened next would become the most infamous moment in tennis history. Next time on Snap.
I mean, the balls that we were using at the Australian Open at the time was a brand called NASA from Courier. They were horrific.
Pernfors was a tough guy. I mean, as far as a competitor goes. And, he had Jon flustered and frustrated.
So I decided to go over and sort of give him a stare down. I figured that way I couldn't get any type of warning or anything. If I didn't say anything, but, how could anything happen?
And that was the start of that process of him being out.
Snap is an AO Originals podcast with Backchat Studios. Written and edited by Lochlainn Harte. Narrated and produced by Jon Hoevenaars. Supervising producer is Adrian Houghton. Original interviews by Shannon Davis. Recorded by Marcus Buttigieg. Executive producer is Xavier Muhlebach. Thank you to the guests whose voices helped tell this story.